I can't get it.
Okay.
Yes. Yes. It's perfect. What about some additional books on there?
Let's try.
Ah.
Yeah, that's good, that's good. So that is on backwards.
Okay. All right. Should we start with the prayer? Or do you need a moment? Oh, you're gone. Oh, there you are again. Okay.
Yes, please. I go for refuge. Refuge. Right. I'm a practice of treating myself with perfection. May I become a Buddha to add to
Hello, can you hear me? Oops, I'm alone. Ah, there you are. Suddenly it was just me.
Sorry about having some technical difficulties today.
Okay. Is your internet slightly slow or? Because you keep breaking off.
I'll try another one.
Okay.
Can you hear me clearly now?
Yes, I can. Yes, I can. Yes, you're no longer breaking up.
Oh, great. Okay.
Great. Let's start. I like the questions you put in here. I went through them last time. I forgot. For instance, Shmuel talked about is the blanketness or the nothingness of a person fainting appearing to the mind as they are fainting or as they're in deep sleep the same? I don't know. I mean, I haven't seen anything in the text. I suppose it is. That's just one thing that comes to mind. Everything else is just something you have been discussing. That's great. Very good. We'll come to this. There's no harm in, of course, already discussing it online, but there's no point for me to react because we're actually getting more into this. Oh, there's one question by someone called A, just A appears, about, this is about someone calls it inattentive cognizer. I call it an awareness to which the object appears but is not ascertained, which is a little bit long. And again, we'll discuss that. It's true what the person says, whoever is A, saying that, who's A? Oh, you're A. All right. Okay. Yeah, I see. Great. No, this is a very important question. It's very nice. It's a good question, but we need to get into that. Yeah, what is it about sense consciousnesses? They're aware of something, it doesn't count unless the mental consciousness is aware of it. So shouldn't there be some extra description, if you like, an extra feature that is added to a mental consciousness? Well, once we get to it, we'll see. But it's great that you're having these thoughts. Okay, so let's take a look at the text. page, we said it yesterday, the ways of categorizing cognition. That was like 43, wasn't it? I thought someone said 46 or 43. Yeah. And okay, I couldn't hear that. You were breaking up, but never mind. You've got the page numbers. So let's now go through it slowly. What I noticed is that I'm not in agreement when it comes to many of the terms in here. It's quite difficult, and I think there's also one mistake I found. But anyway, we'll go through it. So, to understand the presentation of mind, early Buddhist texts offer many ways of categorizing cognition. That's really the way to learn about the mind, to understand the different divisions. That's the kind of main aspect, or the most important presentation are the different types, and based on that we get a good understanding of what consciousness is. So these are included within the sevenfold typology of cognition, the threefold division, and various twofold divisions. Now traditionally the sevenfold is presented first, but not in this book, which I totally agree with. I think it's a good idea not to start with the sevenfold division of mind, because it's a little complicated, and to prepare the mind better, to prepare ourselves better to understanding the sevenfold division, I think it's good to start with the other divisions. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, great. Okay, so the sevenfold comes later. Then the authors mention the threefold division of mind. The threefold division: conceptual consciousness, which has a universal as its observed object. There's the first one, universal. Universal? Seriously? The problem with this word is that actually in the Pramanavartika literature, you'll find the debate between Buddhists and non-Buddhists about, are there universals versus the instances of objects. So let's say table, the table you have in front of you. Those are all particular tables, particular instances of table. But then there's the question, is there like an overarching tableness, some table that is none of the instances that you have in front of you, for instance, but something that exists separately from them? That is usually, I guess, also aligning with modern philosophy, with Western philosophy, that also discuss like universals. I think the word universal is a good term to describe it as a universal that exists separate from everything that is not it. So in general, let's say that it has nothing to do with our mind, it has nothing to do uh, with our culture, just the sense that there must be tableness somewhere, or with numbers, like how do numbers exist, 1 2 3 4 5 and so forth. Is there like a one somewhere in space, and therefore you can count pencils? If you have one pencil, then 1 2, you have 2 cakes, then you say 2 and so forth. There's like a beautiful YouTube video actually on that. How do numbers exist? The Platonian way, as like you have this universal number somewhere. Another way is that they're just nominal, and a third way is are they just imaginations? Do they not exist at all? They're just imagined. Very interesting idea, because it gets right down to Madhyamika. 2 extremes, 1 middle way. So here, one extreme is the Platonian idea that there's this number somewhere in space, 1 and 2. Those we don't perceive, but because these are universals exist, we can count things. Likewise with a table. There's somewhere a table, a general table in the universe, and that's why we have the different instances of these tables. And there are philosophical schools in India, at least at the time of the Buddha, who asserted that, who very strongly propounded, or had this, or held this belief that there are these universals. Without them, you couldn't have their instances. And Buddhists debate with them, saying it's impossible. It's impossible to have these universals. So I think in this context, to use the word universal is really helpful as like something that applies to all classes or categories of a phenomenon. And that's kind of an absolute phenomenon, which is totally separate from its particulars, from its instances. So you need a word for that to be able to discuss it. But here, I think a better word would be generalities, because they're very personal. They're very personal. So what do I personally, what does a table mean to me? For instance, if I think of a table, there's a beautiful article by a magazine that's called Scientific American Mind, an older version of that. It's probably like 15 years old now. I've got it somewhere. I have to look for it, maybe for next time. Where even in modern science, they talk about these generalities that you, for instance, think of the table this morning that you had your breakfast at. If you take it to mind, a general image of that appears to your mind. If you think about it, if you reflect on it. And everyone's image is slightly different depending on where you sat on the table, even if it was just one long table that you sat at. But the point is, there's a general sense of that table based on the way it appeared to your sense consciousness, what you associate with it, and that is called this generality. Okay? You can even do a test. For instance, if I ask you to look at the wall that faces you, look at the wall. Okay, so right now you see the actual wall. That is the wall itself. But if I ask you, close your eyes and think of the wall, just close your eyes, think of the wall, it still appears, but in a more general sense, based on what appeared to you earlier. However, just a general kind of, that's what this wall means to me. And that is called a general, a meaning generality, some people call it, or a general image. I wouldn't call it universal, because otherwise we run out of words for this debate, this major debate between Buddhists and some of the non-Buddhist philosophers. So meaning generality is like a literal translation from the Tibetan, turn chi, but it's not a good translation in the sense that turn here means the object and chi means the generality. So it's the generality of the object. Turn can be translated as meaning, but it doesn't always mean meaning. And I think the first translators that coined this term possibly thought it only refers to meaning. But according to my, of course, very limited understanding, here turn means the object. And it's a generality of that which you're trying to think of. Like, for instance, the wall, when you close your eyes, you have no access to the wall in the way you do when your eyes are open. So you're only left with getting at the object, the wall, by way of that image that appears to your mental consciousness. You're all aware, right, that the wall appears to you. Not as vividly, not with all its nitty-gritty details, I don't know, the stains, the cracks, and so forth. However, it does appear to you. And this is very interesting how this is even depicted in movies. You know, when the hero is remembering beating someone up or whatever, right? It's usually in black and white, or it's kind of hazy. It's got these hazy edges, like they're. It's just a memory. It's usually when you see it like in black and white, whereas usually the rest of the movie is in color, or when you see it's kind of like a little hazy at the edges, you know they're remembering something. Well, this is how this image, this general image, that generic image, how it appears to the mind is not as clear. It lacks that clarity. And it's not the actual thing itself. It's really just an objective sense to you personally, an objective representation of the wall, for instance, or of any other thing. If you think of a car, just think of a car. Take a moment to think of a car. Raise your hand if the car is red. that you think of? Yeah, funny enough, it's red. Raise your hand if it's white. All right, there's some white cars. There you go. Raise your hand if it's purple. No. Okay. All right. So different colors. I'm not going to go through all the colors, but you see, blue, for some reason, red seems to be a favorite when it comes to cars. But the point is, it appears differently to us. At least three people, I think it was three, raising their hands when it came to white cars. So not everyone raised their hand when I ask about red cars or white cars. So therefore, it's even different in terms of the color, the shape. Not even going to go into the shape, round or whatever, or Toyota or whatever. The point is we individually have a general sense of car. And when I ask you to think about it, that's what appears. And we can analyze the car, we can remember the car, we can understand car by way of this generic image appearing to the mind. And I guess in that way, it becomes clear what a conceptual consciousness is. In the sense, it's a mental consciousness, of course, foremost, it's it cannot be a sense consciousness, it can only be a mental consciousness. And what is its main characteristic? The main characteristic is that the actual object cannot appear to it. It doesn't have access to the actual object. There are two ways you can gain access to an actual object, either through sense perception or through meditation. Now, you're not meditating on car for, month on end and generate calm abiding in relation to that. So who cares? Just look at a car. You don't need to generate a meditative equipoise on a car, which is like, why would you do that? So therefore, it's usually just if you have a mental consciousness, taking to mind a car, it's that generic image of the car, which seems to be a car, but it isn't. It's not an actual car. It's just an image of a car. And that's why this mind is mistaken. Mistaken in the Buddhist context means mistaken with regard to the appearance. That's it. Whether something is whether a mind is mistaken or not has to always do with the way things appear. Therefore, you can have minds that are not wrong, because wrong or not means its main object doesn't exist. Right? That's kind of a rule of thumb, if you like. Do you want to know whether a consciousness is actually wrong? Well, check whether its main object exists or not. The appearing car, that generic image of the car, when you think about the car, is not the main object of that mental consciousness. When you're thinking about a car, it's the car itself. An actual car is your main object. An actual car exists, but it can only appear to you via the appearance of the generic image because you have no access to it. You don't have it right in front of you. There's no car right in front of you. And again, you haven't meditated on a car in such a way that one day it just appears to your mind directly. All right. Therefore, your main object when you think about a car is the car itself, and that exists, which means a mental consciousness or conceptual consciousness which thinks about a car is a mistaken mind because its secondary object, the generic image of the car, appears to be the actual car, but it's not. Right? So therefore, because it appears in a way, because something appears in a way in which it doesn't exist, we call that mind a mistaken mind. But whether it's wrong or not, that depends whether its main objects exist or not, and it does. Does that make sense? That distinction? So when would it be a wrong consciousness? If I thought about the horns of a rabbit, a generic image of the horns of the rabbit would appear. So with regard to that, it would be mistaken. The generic image of the horns of the rabbit appear to be the horns of a rabbit, and they're not. So it's mistaken. But whether it's a wrong consciousness or not, that is determined by the main object existing or not. So the horns of a rabbit are the main object, and they don't exist, as we all know. Right? Okay, so the main object. It's the hint is like, how do we, for instance, how do we express this? We say an eye, a conceptual consciousness perceiving the horns of a rabbit. So the way we express it, the horns of the rabbit, it's clear that is its main object. We don't talk about a conceptual consciousness to which the horns of the generic image of the horns of a rabbit appear. That's usually not how you describe a particular mind. Well, a particular mind when you want to point out what they're getting at. In the text, it's always described a conceptual consciousness thinking about a vase, a conceptual consciousness knowing a vase, a conceptual consciousness apprehending a vase. From that, you know automatically in a debate situation, for instance, you know the main object is the vase. Does it exist? Yes. So it's a correct consciousness. But because it's a conceptual mind, it is necessarily mistaken because it can only access its main object, the vase in this case, by way of the appearance of the generic image of the vase. Because otherwise there's no access. The mind has no access to it. Sometimes they do describe it a bit like that. They give different analogies. So one analogy may be our conceptual consciousness is like the object is covered in the veil. For instance, if you take an actual vase and you cover it with a veil, like with a transparent kind of white veil, like a very thin cheesecloth, for instance, you can see the vase, but not directly. You see it through the veil. You can still say, oh, it looks like this, it looks like that, it's got this color. You can tell, but you don't see it directly. Now, of course, here the mind is non-physical, there's no veil, but it's close enough that the analogy kind of can get us a sense why a conceptual mind is an indirect mind. It's veiled through the generic image, through the veil of the generic image, which appears to be the actual thing. We perceive the vase. Does that make sense? Is it clear? Oh, that is Mattia. Yes, go ahead.
Just
Yes.
a quick one. When you say wrong mind, is it a synonym of deceptive mind?
A deceptive mind. Well, there's a bit of a problem. The word deceptive here is wrong when it comes to at the bottom of this page, at least in my version. It talks about the twofold division of valid cognition versus non-valid cognition is made from the perspective of whether a cognition is newly realizing or is deceptive or non-deceptive. That is not a correct. It's not. It should be controvertible or controvertible or incontrovertible. That's the difference between valid consciousness and non-valid consciousness. But we get to that. So deceptive, I don't think that's a correct word because, sorry, you could say deceptive, but then you can't use the word deceptive when you distinguish between a valid cognition or not. And it'll become clear why.
Yeah, because I heard it in reference to an error when it comes to the apprehension of the object, not the appearance, but the apprehension of the object. I heard
Yes.
that word.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. It's in terms of what you apprehend. So the main object, yes, you can put it in that way as well, saying what is apprehended. Why? Because the meaning generality is not apprehended. Although, and this is the difficulty, it is sometimes described as apprehending the meaning generality, but that can't be taken literally. There's one problem. In some of the Tibetan texts, they use the word zimba, which means apprehend, the same way as you would use it when you use the word appear. And that can get very confusing. It's clear from the context, usually when the word apprehend is used as if they, or if it's used in the context, and sometimes from the context, it's clear when the word apprehend is used like the word appearing. Sometimes you know. Okay, that's a little bit confusing. But in general, yes, we have to distinguish between something merely appearing and something being apprehended.
Thank you.
Merely appearing. So if it's apprehended and that which is apprehended doesn't exist, it's a wrong consciousness. If there's merely the appearance of something that doesn't make sense, so the meaning generality appearing to be the actual thing, then if the mind, if the main object that is apprehended exists, it's merely a mistaken consciousness. See the difference? Yeah. Okay, so conceptual consciousness, which has a universal as its observed object. Okay, has as its meaning generality as its observed object. Again, I wouldn't use the word observed here. You're not observing that. Appearing object. In Tibetan, it literally says the object that is to be apprehended. The object that is to be apprehended. And again, it's one of those times when the word apprehend here means to appear. When you debate it, it becomes clear right away. So you debate, oh, it's so the meaning generality, the subject, the meaning generality, it follows that it's apprehended by that mind. Why? Because it's the apprehended object or the object that is to be apprehended. No pervasion. Simple as that. So even though it's called that, it is actually the appearing object, which is why if I were the English translator here, I would not use the word observe because that's misleading. Universal, I don't think is the right kind of word. And this is just my opinion. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but I think it's misleading. If people read this, they believe that meaning generality. So for instance, if I think of the wall when I close my eyes, then that is merely the appearance of that wall. That is the meaning generality, the generic image of this wall is merely appearing to my mind. I'm not observing that. I'm observing the wall by way of what appears to me. So indirectly, something always has to appear to my mind. The thing itself cannot appear directly, only through what the wall means to me through that appearance. And indirectly through that appearance, I can perceive the wall. Does that make sense? Kelsey, does it make sense? Does it make sense? Do you want me to repeat it?
That would be great, thanks.
Yeah, okay. So what I was saying was this. Here it says in the English text, it says conceptual consciousness which has as a universal or as a generic image, which has a generic image as its observed object. Observed here should be appearing object. It's not observed by the mind because the mind is not aware of that generic image. Another mind may be aware of what is appearing, but not the mind itself. Not the mind itself, according to the Sautrantika school, is aware of that. The Prasangika school says that the mind is aware of its meaning generality. Yes, it is. It does say that. So maybe that's why observed object. Okay, in the Prasangika school, it's correct, actually. In the Prasangika school, you could say that. It's actually not just observed, it's known by the mind. It gets a little bit confusing. That's why studying both schools kind of together, in one way, you have to learn the Sautrantika school and the Chittamatra to study the second chapter. On the other hand, the book is from the point of view of the Prasangika school. In the Prasangika school, okay, I tell you right from the beginning, they say a mind, a consciousness, always knows what appears to it. Any consciousness, whether it's an incorrect consciousness, whether it's a wrong consciousness, it always knows what appears to it. It's always a valid cognition with regard to what appears to it. So this is very different from all the other schools, but it makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense. So yes, therefore saying as its observed object, it's less about observing it as knowing it, right? So again, the word observed still, I don't like the word observed because observed means you spend some time observing it, doesn't it? Whereas actually in the Prasangika school, they say that when you perceive, for instance, the wall, based on the example I gave you earlier, closing your eyes and taking to mind the wall, of course, your main object is the wall itself. It's the actual wall, and that you know. Your memory knows, through your memory, you know the wall. But you also know that the generic image of the wall appears to you. So you also know the generic image of the wall. Only the Prasangika school says that. Only they say that. They say when you, for instance, see the horns of a rabbit, when you perceive the horns of a rabbit, where's Shmuel? He's not here. Okay, never mind. Okay, so when you see the horns of a rabbit, then not only is your main object the horns of the rabbit, but you're also aware of the appearance of horns of a rabbit. So your mind actually knows, and the appearance of the horns of a rabbit exists. So even a wrong consciousness can know something. Even the wrong consciousness can know just the appearance of the horns of a rabbit. So yeah, that's a little bit stretching it a little bit, because usually that's not what you learn. In the very beginning, you're told wrong consciousness doesn't know anything, just wrongly perceives something. Conceptual consciousness, perceiving a table, a vase, whatever, doesn't know anything but its main object. So the lower schools, of course, prepare the mind for more complicated ideas. It makes the mind more flexible. And so here you're right away introduced through this text to the Prasangika school, which can be a little bit confusing, right? But please say so. If it's too confusing, maybe I'll find a solution to change it just to the Sautrantika school. But yeah, so just for the time being, that's an important distinction. I would still not use the word observed here, because observing is a particular activity that I don't think is taking place no matter what the school is. I would say appearing object. So conceptual consciousness, which has a generic image as its appearing object. Number one. Number two, an unmistaken non-conceptual consciousness. Again, this is not Prasangika. This is Sautrantika, actually. Because unmistaken non-conceptual, as you know, in the Prasangika school, the only unmistaken minds are the minds that realize emptiness directly. So a little bit, this whole text is like a mixture between the different schools, which can be quite confusing. But honestly, calling it an unmistaken non-conceptual consciousness, which has a unique particular as its observed object, that's pretty much Sautrantika. Yeah. Especially the example that is given here, a direct perception perceiving a form. So this is definitely Sautrantika. Here, this page, this paragraph is Sautrantika. So again, what I said earlier about the observed object, yeah, absolutely. Appearing object is a better translation. The next version is a non-mistaken mind, a direct perceiver, which has a unique particular. Unique particular is another word for saying impermanent. In this particular school, something that is a unique particular is an impermanent phenomenon. Unique particular. What a weird translation. Anyway, never mind. I have to think about it. As its observed object. And then mistaken non-conceptual consciousness, which has a clear appearance of a non-existent as its appearing object. Okay? A mistaken non-conceptual consciousness. So number one is basically a mind that's merely mistaken. Number two is a correct mind. And number three is a wrong mind. So it's a beautiful way of introducing this exclusive division of consciousness. Whatever is a mind, either it's a correct mind. That means it's neither mistaken nor wrong. Okay. Or it's merely mistaken, not wrong, but mistaken. Or lastly, it's wrong. Its main object doesn't exist. Its apprehended object doesn't exist. And therefore it's also mistaken. Whatever's a wrong consciousness must be mistaken. Whatever's mistaken is not necessarily wrong. Posit it. the subject. So whatever, it follows that whatever is a wrong consciousness is necessarily a mistaken consciousness.
Except.
Whatever is a mistaken consciousness, it follows is not necessarily a wrong consciousness.
Except.
Posited.
Conceptual consciousness, thinking about dinner.
Yeah, very good. Dinner exists, so not right now, but yeah, very good. Excellent. That's it. All right. So therefore, here you have these three categories. Sometimes they give the example of a mirror image, right? You perceive the mirror image as the image of your face as the reflection of a face. Okay, correct. It appears as a reflection. It is a reflection. Let's say that really appeared to you. Usually it appears to be your face, but let's say you're a Buddha, so the reflection of your face appears to be a reflection. That's a correct consciousness. So no mistaken appearance. Right? Okay, Venerable Teacher, you've got a question mark on your face.
Well, I'm just thinking this
Pardon?
seems a very complicated example. Couldn't you just say like?
Very complicated.
seeing
Well, I haven't
just-
finished the example yet. Let's see
Okay.
whether it's still complicated. Let's take like, all right. The second is like the reflection appears to be your face, but you know it's not your face. Right? Ordinary people like us, I look in the mirror, there's something black. I'm not going to try to remove the black in the mirror. I try to remove it on my nose, right? So I know this is not my face, but it still appears to me. And then the last is like a child looking in the mirror and believing there to be another child. So you have three scenarios, right? You have someone who recognizes the reflection to be a reflection. So it doesn't appear to be their face, doesn't appear that way. It appears to be a reflection and they believe that that's what it is. Then you have a mind to which it appears to be your face, but you know it's not. And a third mind that is mistaken. Of course, I could give another example, but I'm not sure whether that's more helpful. For instance, when you have a magician that conjures something. I mean, we don't really know these musicians. They don't really walk around. Even now here in India, I haven't even met one yet. I've been here for so long, but I've not come across a magician that takes a pebble and a piece of wood and conjures up a horse and an elephant, right? So it's like through your mind, through the mantra, it affects your mind. And so even though you know there's no horse or an elephant, it still appears that way. And then there's someone, so you have a whole group of people, the magician involved himself or herself, when they conjure up this, they have this appearance of a horse and an elephant, where they themselves are also affected by the mantra. So the audience, of course, they believe there to be a horse and an elephant. They don't know it's just some kind of trick, some kind of whatever. It affects your mind in such a way that you believe that to be true. So like a hypnosis, if you like. So they're like hypnotized. They believe there's a real elephant and a horse. The magician knows there's no real elephant and a horse, that it's just because of the mantra, the spell, whatever they spoke. And then there's an audience where there's someone who comes later on, not affected by the spell. And so they just see the pebble and the stick. Right? So this is the same idea here. The last person to come late, they have a correct consciousness. The magician who knows is not really there. They don't have a wrong consciousness, but a mistaken consciousness. It appears to be an actual horse and a mistaken, appears to be an actual horse and an elephant, but they don't believe in it. Therefore, they're just mistaken. The appearance is just mistaken. And then there's the audience who's fooled by the spell, who's hypnotized, whatever, by that spell, and therefore believe there to be a horse and an elephant. Yeah, so maybe that's better than mirrors, but I wasn't so sure about the magician. Unless, Venerable Teacher, if you have another example, please, by all means, if you come up with another one. Okay, yeah, maybe you can come up, or any of you comes up with another one later. So in that way, you have these three, and it's a really nice way of saying, well, if you have a consciousness, you've got one of the three. Correct? Merely mistaken, wrong. Okay. Examples of these are, in the first case, a conceptual consciousness perceiving a pot or a vase. Pot. Okay. I'm thinking, like, where does the word pot, vase, Pumbaa in Tibetan actually come from? Well, usually the teachings were given in a prayer hall, and you had, for instance, these initiation vases. I wouldn't call them pots. I'd rather call them vase. Oh, look at this initiation pot. So I have a preference. I was wondering, where does the Pumbaa come from? I don't think they think of cooking pots. They're rather thinking of these elegant vases, and they're usually defined as like a bulbous flat-faced phenomenon able to perform the function of holding water. What kind of water? Of course, for the initiation. So I'm a fan of vase, but never mind, pot is fine as well. In the second case, a direct perception perceiving a form, something physical, something, well, here physical means a visual object. Although it could also be just a general, no, it doesn't have to be an eye consciousness, sorry. It could also be just any sense object. Sometimes the word form means specifically a visual object, and in other contexts, it means like anything that is a sense object. So the word is used in different ways, in those two ways, basically. In the third case, a distorted non-conceptual consciousness to which a snow mountain appears yellow. Kind of cute how the Tibetan authors, I looked it up in the Tibetan, it says yellow, because it's usually always blue. The example is always of a blue snow mountain. So they were thinking, oh, this is for foreigners. Let's make it a yellow. I haven't really heard of that. It's always blue, but yellow is nice as well. Okay, so the threefold division is made from the point of view of the observed object and represents principally the Sautrantika viewpoint. Oh, my own fault. Yes, it does say there, Sautrantika viewpoint. I didn't pay attention to that. So it does here specifically refer to the Sautrantika viewpoint, not to the Prasangika viewpoint. Therefore, observed object shouldn't be there, should be appearing object. Okay, so that's the threefold division. That's it. No more details on that. You don't need any more details on that because you've understood it. The three. Correct? Merely mistaken? Wrong. Wrong and therefore also mistaken. Because if it's wrong, its apprehended object necessarily appears to it, and the horns of a rabbit appear to be existent to that mind. And so, of course, it's mistaken. All right. Great. Pardon? Yes, please.
Sure. Can you listen? Can you hear? Is it clear, my voice?
Oh, yeah. Could you pick up the mic? Yeah.
The mics are not. Where did you turn it on?
There was one.
Or if someone who's nearby, if you could say it again and tell Kelsey, then I can hear. I can hear Kelsey better. Or Vanilla Texture. Or you.
Consciousness cannot be erroneous. That conceptual consciousness are necessarily okay.
It works. Hello.
Yes, hello. I can hear you.
So it seems, for the way you're presenting it, that conceptual consciousness cannot be erroneous, that they are necessarily mistaken.
They're necessarily mistaken. They can also be wrong.
I see.
Yeah. They can be wrong, but then it would be part of the okay, conceptual consciousness which has a it could, the conceptual consciousness which has as a universal as its observed object. Yes, it could also be a wrong consciousness. It could be a wrong consciousness, but here it's introducing those three just in general. It's not about saying, oh, the first is always a mistaken mind. It's just giving that general, like you have a mistaken mind, especially based on the example, it becomes clear, perceiving a pot. Right? So it's perceiving a pot. Of course, there's a conceptual consciousness that could be wrong, like a conceptual consciousness perceiving the horns of a rabbit. But just to give you a sense, consciousness is one of the three. Here you have examples of one of the three. It's not saying, you see, like, usually the way it's presented in the text is with this description 1, 2, 3, and then the examples. So strictly speaking, the first one, it gives an example of something that does exist, a pot, a vase. Therefore, based on that, we are introduced to a mind that is merely mistaken. But it's not implying, oh, conceptual consciousness, which takes a meaning generality as its appearing object, is necessarily only mistaken. That's not what this is teaching us. That's not what it's indicating here.
Right.
Does that
So
make
this,
sense?
so these divisions of mind do not like strictly correspond to
No,
merely mistaken, correct, and wrong.
no. It's just saying it's introducing to us this threefold division. You see, that's the only presentation you find usually in the Lorig text. It's just introducing these three. And then it doesn't go into their definitions and their divisions or anything, unlike the other types of mind.
Right.
Right? So I remember our teachers would usually say, well, that's because it's just presenting to us in terms of wrong, mistaken, or merely mistaken and correct. That's what it's presenting. But it's not now saying that the first type is always merely mistaken. No, that's not what this means.
Okay.
I mean, you may wonder why, you see, oftentimes when you hear something, when you study something, a natural question arises, why was this taught? Why is this presented? When you don't give any definition, in this case, no divisions, just an example of each, and that's it. So the answer to that, one answer, I would say, of course, I'm sure there are other ones as well, is that in this case, it presents just examples of these three: mistaken, merely mistaken, wrong, and correct. All right.
But the third one, mistaken non-conceptual consciousness,
That's more specific. Yeah.
that's necessarily erroneous, right?
That is necessarily a wrong consciousness, yes. A
see.
mistaken non-conceptual consciousness, a mistake. In the Prasangika school, it wouldn't have to be, but it's Sautantrika, and in the Sautantrika school, a non-conceptual mind that is mistaken must be wrong.
Right. And then
Yeah.
the second one is necessarily correct, right? The second one.
Unmistaken non-conceptual consciousness, yes. Exactly.
Right. But the first one can either be mistaken or
Or
erroneous.
wrong. Absolutely.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. I mean, you could also say it doesn't just introduce merely mistaken, it just introduces mistaken. Okay, then your argument in the beginning would even work. Mistaken, right? Because here it could be mistaken. It could, like if it was a wrong consciousness, it would also be mistaken.
Right.
Yeah. But usually they say merely mistaken and so forth. Okay. Number 3. The various twofold divisions are sense consciousness versus mental consciousness, conceptual versus non-conceptual, valid versus non-valid, mistaken versus unmistaken, those that engage via exclusion versus those that engage via affirmation, and mind and mental factors. So some of those we'll explain, all of them really, except for mind and mental factors. We'll go into them, but not into all the details, not into all the mental factors. No need to do that. Okay. These 6 divisions are listed in the text presenting such categories. The twofold division of sense consciousness versus mental consciousness is made from the perspective of whether the relevant cognition, it doesn't have that in Tibetan, the relevant cognition, never mind, needs to be based on a physical sense faculty as its dominant condition. Okay, let me just look what it says in Tibetan. In Tibetan, the relevant cognition can be misunderstood. It's like, why do they say relevant cognition? But it's just for the sake of clarity, I guess. Just a sec. In Tibetan, it just says the difference. So the difference between them is whether the twofold division of the twofold division of sense consciousness versus mental consciousness is made from the perspective of whether it's based on a physical sense faculty or not. That's all it says. So the relevant cognition is not mentioned. So I guess it's just for the sake of clarity. The twofold division of conceptual consciousness versus non-conceptual consciousness is made from the perspective of whether a linguistic referent appears at that. This is, I think, a mistake. This is a mistake, I believe, because what it says in Tibetan, it says da-tön, da-tön. So da-tön, Actually, datun, da means sounds, tön means meaning. And here the translator translates this word literally, but it can also be an abbreviation of dachi dan tunchi. I think it's an abbreviation of dachi dan tunchi. Because, and this is beautifully explained in Mind in Tibetan Buddhism. In Mind in Tibetan Buddhism, he gives a very beautiful explanation. Page, I think it's 46. I think I seem to remember. Page 46. He gives this beautiful explanation. I don't find it now. Direct perceivers. Oh, yes. Okay. This is a little complicated, but might as well mention it now. If I ask you to think about an ocean, it gives the example of an ocean. That's on page 50. There are two ways by which you can think about an ocean. One way is you don't know the word ocean. You've never heard the word ocean, but you've seen an ocean. You've seen the ocean. You don't know what it's called. And in that moment, when someone asks you to, well, think about what you saw today, for instance, without giving it any name, you have a generic image of that ocean, right? You don't know what it's called. You have a generic image that appears to your mind. That's the generic image here. That's the generic image that is not verbal, but it's visual. Okay. In Tibetan, they would say, they draw this distinction between the generality of a sound and the generality of the object itself. That's the distinction, or meaning generality. Sometimes they say sound generality and meaning generality, but literally a better translation would be a generality of the object itself, the ocean itself, and the generality of the word ocean. So the example I gave you was not knowing the word ocean in any language, just knowing what you've seen, like the shape and color of an ocean, or at least the part of the ocean that you've seen. And if you now think about the ocean, the generality of that object appears. Okay. But let's take the other scenario. You have never seen an ocean. You don't know what it looks like. You don't know what it smells like. You don't know anything. You just hear the word ocean and someone asks you to think about ocean, right? So what does appear to your mind? The word ocean, right? Any word. If I use the word potokoto, I say potokoto, it doesn't mean anything to you. So potokoto or whatever, just some word. Let's say the word ocean, you've never heard it. I ask you to think about ocean and you can do that. But usually, so this is like where you only have the sound generality, that is the generality of the word that appears to your mind. And then lastly, you have both, where you know it's an ocean, but you've also both appear to your mind, like mixed. An ocean appears and the word appears. And that is what's usually the case once you've learned language. Like I may ask you, in what language are you thinking? Right now, it's likely to be English. Unless you feel more comfortable with your native language, if English is not your native language, or you force yourself to think in Tibetan, as I'm explaining it in English. That's very unlikely, but still, you'd never know. You may think in a different language. This is a very good way of learning Tibetan for those who are interested. Force yourself to think in Tibetan. That's what I did. Because when I learned Tibetan, Tibetans weren't ready to speak to Westerners who couldn't speak English. So they ran away when they heard me in my broken Tibetan. So I couldn't really practice. So I talked to myself and I forced myself to think in Tibetan. That really helped. Never mind, just for those who are learning Tibetan. But the point is, we're always thinking in a particular language. And it's usually mixed. If I tell you, oh, the ocean, I've just seen the ocean. So that word appears to your mind. You may reflect on the word, but also the ocean itself, whatever the ocean means to you appears to your mind. And they appear as mixed. And that's what also the text here talks about. It mentions, it says apprehended. This is one of the times when apprehended is used in a very loose sense, when really it means appear. Basically, what we've learned is that the generality of the word, It's not actually a word. A word is a sound, and the sound, of course, doesn't. It's not like a sound that appears. It's just a generality of the word, right? Of the sound, and a generality of the object. They appear mixed to your mind, and in that way, you take to mind the ocean. I'm sorry, I added this extra complication, but well, it is added right from the beginning, except Datun Ginawa. Here it says Datun. I don't think it's the linguistic referent. That wouldn't make sense, because if it were the linguistic referent, what about those who haven't learned what ocean is yet? I mean, who haven't learned the word ocean yet? They'd have a problem. I don't think that's a correct. You could say the linguistic generality and the linguistic generality and the visual generality. I mean, usually ocean, we think of its shape and color versus its smell. Yeah, that's only secondary, since our eye consciousness is most dominant. So I believe this is a mistake. I think it would be better to say the two divisions of conceptual consciousness versus non-conceptual consciousness is made from the perspective of whether the one of the two. So Datun can also mean one of the two. The way it's used in Tibetan, it doesn't have to be both, but one of the two. So the linguistic generality, or the meaning or the image generality, whether one of these two appear to that cognition, right? If one of the two appear, then you have a conceptual consciousness by definition. One of the two or both, whichever way. Okay. All right. The twofold division of valid consciousness versus non-valid consciousness is made from the perspective of whether a cognition is newly realizing or is deceptive or non-deceptive. I believe there's a mistake. First of all, in the Sautrantika school, the word is actually not valid cognition, but prime cognition. Because pramana, pra is the first syllable. Sorry for my terrible pronunciation. So pra can mean prime, and it can mean main or valid. Yeah, valid, I guess you could say. So it depends on how you define the word pramana. In the Sautrantika school, it mainly refers to knowing its object, realizing its object, but doing so newly. Versus the other schools, for instance, the Prasangika school, even if you perceive it for the second time, the third time, it's still pramana. The point is that you realize your object, you know your object, you realize it. Okay. So valid, it could really be called here in the Sautrantika context prime cognition or prime consciousness. Here they say valid consciousness. The thing is, okay, so valid consciousness is fine, valid cognition or valid consciousness, you can also call it that, but in the Sautrantika context, usually in English translations, you find the word prime consciousness more frequently. Never mind. So valid here. Okay, valid, non-valid. This is a little bit problematic. In Tibetan, you don't have that word valid or non-valid, because even a consciousness that doesn't realize its object, but that is a correct consciousness, is a non-valid consciousness. For instance, if I believe emptiness exists, I don't realize emptiness. I just believe emptiness exists. That's a non-valid consciousness, a non-valid consciousness, or a non-valid cognition. I mean, it doesn't cognize anything, but it's not a mistaken or wrong mind. It's not deceptive. I believe emptiness exists. So that falls under the category of non-pramana, simply because it doesn't realize its object. So pramana is that which realizes its object newly. Non-pramana is just the opposite of that, a mind that doesn't do that. Does that make sense? So tsemin, or not a pramana, that's literally how you would translate it if you use the Sanskrit word. Non-pramana is anything that does not realize its object newly. And that includes non-deceptive minds. It includes, for instance, a mind that realized the second moment of an eye consciousness realizing vas. It's non-pramana, but it's not deceptive. It even realizes its object, just not newly. It's the second moment. Is that a little complicated? Well, it's only complicated because of the vocabulary in English. The English words are misleading. When you say non-valid, it seems to be saying it's a wrong mind. But the second moment of an I consciousness perceiving a vas in the Sautrantika school is a correct mind. It's not mistaken. Is it a pramana, a tsema, like here a valid consciousness? No. Why? Because it doesn't newly realize its object. Right? It's not newly. So controvertible, or it has to be newly incontrovertible. So newly incontrovertible, this is why this is like a little bit misleading. So it's newly realizing or incontrovertible, or is controvertible or incontrovertible. So even if it doesn't newly realize its object, controvertible or incontrovertible, yeah, it's a little confusing. Lumilu. I have to think about it again, but it's a little bit confusing because actually the translation is usually controvertible or incontrovertible. So incontrovertible means you don't leave any doubt as to being a vase, for instance. So you realize it is a vase, so it's incontrovertible. Versus, I believe it's a vase, so it still leaves room for doubt. That would be controvertible. So lumilu can be translated, the Tibetan word can be translated as fallible, for instance, or as deceptive. Yeah, but not in this context. I don't think it believes, I don't think it means deceptive or non-deceptive. I think it means controvertible and non-controvertible. And that's what the initial translators use, that translation. Are you terribly confused now?
No.
No?
Is
No. Okay,
Is
it's not
what
too
we
bad.
call valid cognition?
Pardon?
Is this what we call valid cognition?
Yes, well, valid cognition here in the Sautrantika school is a mind that newly realizes its object,
I
right?
see.
Newly
Correct.
realizes its object. So if it doesn't newly realize its object, it's not pramana. It's not a valid consciousness, according to them.
So this division corresponds to that.
Yes, it just corresponds to that. But I think the words deceptive or non-deceptive can be misleading because non-deceptive seems to suggest that a mind that newly perceives its object but doesn't newly realize its object must be deceptive. But it's not deceptive, it's just not controvertible. It's not incontrovertible, sorry, it's controvertible, it's not incontrovertible. That's why I think the translation here, newly realizing or is deceptive or non-deceptive. I think it's better to say controvertible or incontrovertible. I think that works better. I'm just criticizing the vocabulary here. All right. And the rest is fine. The division of mistaken cognition versus unmistaken cognition is made from the perspective of whether the object, no, again, in Tibetan, it doesn't say that. The division of mistaken cognition versus unmistaken cognition is made from the perspective of whether the object appearing exists, no, whether the object exists as it appears, it says. It says literally in Tibetan. Was that me or was that you? Hello? Can you hear me? Hello?
Yeah, it's 5 minutes.
Are you still there? Can you hear me? Hello? Oh, hello. Can you hear me? All right. Anyway, time is. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry. I think that was me actually. I think my internet just collapsed. So I put on my phone. I'm using my phone now.
Can hear you.
Anyway, the connection is not.
We can hear you, Geshma.
You can hear me. Great. So never mind. Let's leave it here. Anyway, it's 3 o'clock. I'll go more into it next time. There was 2 or 3 things in the text that I want to mention. Never mind, it's not that much. I had a short. Was that you or was that me? I think it was my internet collapsing.
Maybe both.
Oh, both. Okay. All right. Anyway, let's do the dedication prayer and then we'll continue tomorrow. And please read again the next 4 pages. Sorry.
Having thoroughly investigated in accord with all that I've heard, day and night through the 4 reasonings, mind born of reflection on these topics of contemplation, may this discernment sever all doubts.
Great. Thank you and see you
Thank
tomorrow.
you.